This week, we are reviewing Cuban Americans and Dominicans and their experience in the United States. The emergence of Cuban Americans. The focus is on Cubans of South Florida. About the 1970s is when we begin to see Cubans elected to Miami City Commission. Manolo Rebozo was elected in 1973. Prior to that, we only saw migrations of Cubans into Miami. Cubans found it difficult to meander the Democratic Party's nomination process, combined with the view that the Kennedy administration had let the Cuban community down during the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis of the early 1960s. This caused the majority of Cubans to move away from the Democratic Party and exiles to register as Republicans. Now, to be fair, historically, the obstacles to becoming a member of the Democratic Party, if you were a minority, particularly Latinos, were great. And eventually those rules were changed within the Democratic Party, but this was after the Cubans had already fled to the Republican Party. By the 1980s, the whites in Miami-Dade County were divided by the growing voting power of Cubans and the large number of refugees. Every referendum initiated in Miami-Dade County was split along racial and ethnic lines, non-Hispanic whites against the Hispanics. As geographic concentration of Cubans grew into a sprawling ethnic enclave, whites left Miami, which increased their opportunity to elect Cubans to various seats, and now they are a political powerhouse. The growing Cuban power became evident in 1981 with the establishment of the Cuban American National Foundation. The Cubans were obsessed with foreign policy, and CANAF raised large amounts of money and lobbied members of Congress to support the legislation that kept pressure on Cuba. During the 1980s, Cuban Americans formed the Cuban American Caucus. At the national level, the Republican Party reached out to the Cuban community in the democratically controlled areas and ran Cuban candidates against Democrats. Outside of South Florida, Cuban Americans are not the dominant Latino group in urban centers. In Chicago, Boston, and other cities, they are less tied to the Republican Party and more interested in forging multiracial electoral coalitions. Why? Because you have less of a one ethnic minority group. So anytime you look at urban politics and you have a multitude of ethnic and racial groups in a city, the best way to gain power is to forge coalitions. Dominicans and their emergence in U.S. politics. There's a large influx in the United States that happens around the 1960s, right? The 1960s is when the United States is, doing all their invasions into Latin America, and so you have this influx of immigrants from south to north. During the 1960s, the U.S. government sent in 40,000 troops to prevent what they feared was another communist revolution, as had occurred in Cuba, which was the anti-Bosch and for military business regime. The U.S. military occupation marked the beginning of a 30-year war of political instability in the Dominican Republic. The U.S. officials facilitated a mass exodus of the pro-Bosch supporters, but unlike Cuban refugees, the Dominicans were not classified as political refugees, and they received no federal assistance upon arrival. The Dominicans who arrived in the U.S. in the 1960s had skills similar to those of Cubans. They were generally highly educated, politically conscious, and had economic resources and started up small businesses, mainly in New York, right? So part of the reason why the Cuban community was incredibly successful is not only did they have their roots, their visitation from Cuba to Miami long before the mass migration, that they were highly educated, but you had the immediacy location of Cuba, 90 miles away or so. Shortly thereafter, a large number of working class immigrants faced with limited avenues for advancement arrived, and many were undocumented. By the late 1990s, Dominicans were one of the poorest Latino groups on average in the U.S. Because they were concentrated in New York, they had low political visibility, which led to the development of numerous grassroots political organizations. The first political effort centered on the issue of concern in homelands. So for every Latino ethnic group that it moves here to the United States, usually their first attempt at organizing is for their homeland. In the 1960s, voluntary ethnic associations were established, but they didn't run candidates. They only helped elect local Democratic candidates through leafleting and voter mobilization. They didn't quite have the knowledge of campaigns or candidates. But if you look now at the number of Dominicans elected along the East Coast, mainly Rhode Island, there are numerous Dominican elected officials. As new political exiles arrived, ethnic associations began to take on new character that reflects their needs and interests. The 1970s brought with them various associations combined businessmen who could obtain funding from city agencies and younger U.S. educated Dominicans who became active in New York politics. Dominicans had rallies to support and vote for Democratic candidates. By the 1980s, Dominicans were actively participating in party politics, and educational reform in Washington Heights, where they were predominantly located at the time, led to an increase in election to school boards. The 1990s, pressure from Dominican and Puerto Rican communities led to redrawing of New York City electoral maps, which created Dominican majority city council districts in Upper Manhattan. The 1980s and the 1990s saw the Dominican community grow numerically and politically. By the 2000s, Dominican population had spread beyond New York City to numerous cities and communities. However, the 2000 census undercounted Latinos. Now, let me preface this by saying every decennial census undercounts Latinos. It's not unheard of. Dominican migration and incorporation into the U.S. has been limited by both economic and racialized discrimination. The takeaways or conclusion. Latino political incorporation for both Cuban Americans and Dominicans remains tied to their homeland. Cuban Americans are a politically visible community in Florida through elected political office. The electoral fortunes of Dominicans in the United States will continue to be closely connected politically and financially to their home countries for many years to come. Dominicans are primarily Democratic, and next we keep in mind that we will be focusing on Central Americans and contextualize Latino in the broader context of political participation.